All right, let's play a word association game. I'll ask you a question, and there's only one actually. And you tell me what you think of. And it's a question you can answer out loud. Okay, I give you permission. So when I say the name Mother Teresa, what do you think of? A saint? Kindness, I heard. Giving. I'm looking for a particular word. And it begins with an H. Ding, 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 ding. Humility. Right? She's a humble servant, dedicated her life to going out in the streets in impoverished areas and helping people, feeding people, putting salve on their wounds, and all at risk to herself to getting whatever disease it was the person had that she was helping. She is a humble person, and that's why we know who she is, and we remember her and have these thoughts of her and associate these characteristics with her. She was Christ-like. Because of all the things you can say about Jesus, and there are many things you can say, Jesus was humble. That's who he was. You think about the way in which he came to the earth, born in a stable in Bethlehem, and during his life, during his ministry, that 3-year period, he was basically homeless. He didn't have a home. He kind of went from place to place. He didn't really own anything. And when he got near the end of his life, he washed his disciples' feet as a sign of being a servant. And of course, the way he died was a humble death. He died surrendering his life, being stripped and beaten and hung on a cross. And I think we would do well as a church to give thought to that and to consider the role that humility plays in our lives. And I say this because this message today about humility is the third in a series of 3 messages in a series called What's Wrong with the Church? And I thought to have a series like this because of a study that was done that showed that people outside the church, when they were interviewed about church people, this is what they think of you and me. They said church people are judgmental. If I went to church, they would judge me and lecture me. Church people are hypocritical. They don't do what they say and what they believe. And they also said that the God that we speak of, they felt was irrelevant to their lives. So if that's how people outside the church think of us, we would do well to consider how we come across as a church, and maybe even consider changing the way we, quote unquote, do business, the way that we are the church. And so I think thinking about humility is an important thing for the church because it's one of the main characteristics of Christ. And there's something about humility that opens doors and creates bridges and access between people who are believers and those who are yet to become believers. And the Bible has a lot to say about humility. And I want to focus now on 2 particular passages in the Bible that speak to this issue of being humble. And the first one is from Philippians. Some of you might say, wow, that's a mouthful, Philippians. Well, there was a place called Philippi. The Apostle Paul wrote a letter to that church, and so it's called Philippians, the letter to the people of Philippi. And in the 2nd chapter, the Apostle Paul says this about the church and to the church. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, and even death on a cross. That's the nature of Jesus. It's one of humility. So this is the way that God chose to win us back, to save us from our sin, to reach us by sending a humble servant. And so we are challenged to live the same way and to imitate Jesus. I often say that's why we're called Christians, because we're to be like Christ. That's what that title means, to be a Christian. And Jesus himself talked about humility and the role that it should have in our lives. And I'm thinking now about another passage, and that's from Luke chapter 14. And to me, this teaching has kind of a humorous element to it. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus offers an on-the-spot parable. In other words, he saw something, and it made him want to offer a teaching right at that moment because of what he saw. He went to a dinner, and I guess people were fighting over who was going to have the seat of honor. When you go to a banquet or you go someplace, it's important where you sit, right? You got to figure out where is your place, and you don't want to sit in the wrong place. So Jesus is in the midst of this kind of a situation. Luke 14, beginning at verse 7, it says, "When Jesus noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, 'Give this person your seat.' Then, humiliated, you'll have to take the least important seat. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he'll say to you, 'Friend, move up to a better place.' Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." So you get the picture. You go to a wedding reception maybe, and you think, well, I've known the groom since we were kids, so I'm pretty important. And you go and you sit like up by the head table, and then somebody has to come to you and say, that's not where we planned for you to sit. You're in the back. And you have to kind of get up and slink to the back of the room at some table because you thought more highly of yourself than you should. That's what Jesus is saying. He says it's better when you go to start out, sit in the back. Don't assume that you're so great that you're going to have some seat of honor. Sit in the back, and then if that's not where you're supposed to sit, the host will come to you and say, "Friend, why are you sitting way in the back? You're my special friend. Come with me and sit up front." Because in the first case, the first scenario, it's rather embarrassing. So in a way, Jesus is almost saying, this just makes sense to do it this way. But also it makes sense to do it in terms of the kingdom, to not think more of yourself. There's a definition for humility that I've always loved, and it goes like this. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. Does that make sense? It's not thinking less of yourself. It's not about beating yourself up with guilt. It's not about having poor self-esteem. That's not what God's saying in this. It's thinking of yourself less so that you have room to think of others. There's a comedian out there now. He's been around actually for years. His name is Brian Regan. Anybody ever heard of Brian Regan? Yeah, he's real big. So go on YouTube. Look at Brian Regan. He is a funny guy, I'm telling you. And he's clean, so I can recommend him. But anyway, one of his routines, I remember, my kids turned me on to Brian Regan. One of his routines, he talks about when people go to the airport, and observing people's behavior in the airport. And when they're about to get on the plane, and how, you're at the gate and everybody's sitting around, and you're waiting for that person to go to the microphone and say, well, now start boarding. And everybody's, I got to get on. And even if they're not calling your aisle, people will get up and get in line because they want to get on the plane. And Brian Regan says, why do they do that? It's like the plane's not leaving until everybody gets on. So you're sitting here, or you get on the plane and you sit there, but you're not getting any further. And he kind of wonders why people do that. And I think the reason why people do that is because, well, we're impatient for one thing, but it's me first, me first. I want to get mine, make sure I'm taken care of. And Jesus is saying that a humble spirit is one that considers other people, not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. So what does that look like in church? Because when we talk about humility, I'm not talking about just each one of us individually, but I'm talking about as a congregation. Is this a humble church? Is this a place people want to come as a guest because they sense that we're not a bunch of know-it-alls, that we welcome people who might come from different places? So I want to point out about 5 things that to me demonstrate a spirit of humility. And as I mention them, you might say to yourself, is this me or is this our church? So the first one is humility. What does it look like? It means learning from others with different beliefs. And I'm looking at the sermon notes now that I hope you have in your bulletin. Learning from others who have different beliefs. Being willing to engage with someone who believes differently than you. When I realized that God was calling me into the ministry, I went to a Christian college, and I was a religion major. Big surprise. So one of the classes they wanted me to take was called World Religions. So in this class, I learned about Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism. And you might say to yourself, well, if you're going to be a minister, a Christian minister, why do they want you studying all different religions? Well, there's a number of reasons. When we look at how other people believe, for one thing, we realize that we have some things in common. And when we look at the history of some religions, there's some common threads. When we engage with other beliefs, it opens our mind to understand things in a broader sense. When we engage with people with other beliefs, it causes us to look more closely at our own beliefs, our current beliefs, and can lead us to a place of being stronger in our faith because we've heard something different and we want to re-examine what it is that we believe. So when we have that openness to engage with people who don't see things exactly like we do, it can be a positive thing and it can be a sign of humility in saying, you know what, I can learn something and I can grow if I talk to someone who sees even Christianity differently than I do. So that's the first one. Learn from others with different beliefs. The second one is learn from people who are of a different age than you are, a different age than I am. So, older people, are you willing to learn from teenagers? Teenagers, are you willing to learn from us old folks? And everything in between. When there's something wrong with my phone, you know who I go to? My 21-year-old. Victoria, can you show me how to do this? My phone's not working right. Yeah. And I love to see young people who have a great relationship with a grandparent because there's so much that they can learn about life and there's so much wisdom that can be gained from a person that's lived longer. For all of us, my father-in-law is 92. I still love to hear his stories when we sit around at dinner and he talks about years ago when he owned a donut shop and these things. There's always something to be learned if our minds are open to learn from people who are different from us, whether it's different belief or a different age. The third thing is to be willing to admit your mistakes. Be willing to admit your mistakes. I was just reading Money Magazine, the April issue, has an article regarding a study that was done by Harvard Business School where they studied people in employment situations, and they said that managers who are willing to admit their mistakes are far better received by the workers, by employees, than those who just kind of go around saying, no, I never make mistakes. There's an openness or a vulnerability that's expressed in being able to say, you know what, sometimes I don't get it right. And I personally believe that these 2 words are some of the most powerful in the English language. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And I'm not even talking about if you really hurt somebody and you know it and you need to go apologize. I mean even like in a course of a conversation, if you start that way. I'm sorry. I'm just not getting what you're saying. Or I'm sorry. I just see it a little bit differently. Or you know what? I'm sorry, but you see things in a way that I have not yet learned. It's disarming. And it says in a humble spirit, I'm not perfect, I don't understand everything, and I've got room to grow. Being willing to admit our mistakes. And the fourth one is just simply to be able to put others first. We live in a world of instant gratification. I want what I want, and I want it now. And sometimes we have to be willing to take a back seat. Sometimes we have to be willing to step back and let others go first. I mentioned at the earlier service that sometimes when I'm out with my wife, I get blessed because she's in a wheelchair. So sometimes if we're going through the mall or any kind of a store, CVS, and there's somebody nearby, a lot of times people will stop what they're doing and run over and open the door for us, which they don't have to do. But at that moment, they're not thinking of themselves and what they want to get done. They're shopping. They're thinking of somebody else, and they're jumping up to help. And I just think that's great when people do that. So there's so many ways in which we as a church can think about others. And, when we come to church, we want church to be for us. We want to sing the songs we like, and we want to hear the sermon that touches us and be with the people that we like. But sometimes we do have to step back and say, I'm not the only one in the building. And there's other people with other needs. And some days maybe the music or the message doesn't touch me directly, but I know that somewhere somebody is getting touched and getting blessed. And that's a good thing. It's getting outside of ourselves and thinking of other people. And finally, modeling vulnerability. You don't have to always be right. I don't have to always be right. And I know sometimes when I've preached a message and I've mentioned something about my family or one of the personal struggles that I've had, people will come up to me and say, I'm so glad you shared that. Because when you do that, Pastor, then I know that your life is kind of like mine, which is like normal everyday life, and that you struggle the way I do. I remember watching on TV once the great theologian, Dr. Phil. And he was working with a couple, husband and wife, and it wasn't going well. And the husband, he's always arguing with his wife. And so Dr. Phil said to the husband, he said, finally in exasperation, Sir, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? Think about that, Do you always have to be right? Do you always have to have the last word? Is there any element of humility in your life where you can say, okay, I think I'm right. But anyway, I'm going to act like I'm wrong. No. To sincerely say, you know what? I always think that I've got it right, but maybe I don't. And maybe, I need to step back a minute and think about that. And maybe having a fruitful relationship, whether it's in marriage or whether it's the church with the world, maybe that's better and more important than just being right. And I'm not talking about compromising our faith. I'm not talking about watering down our faith in Christ. I'm talking about sharing that faith, but being able to do that once we establish a rapport with someone by being willing to listen to them and receive them and accept them because we approach with a humble spirit. And I really think that when a church does that, I think it can make a tremendous difference. I think that humility, because it's the way of Christ, I think a humble approach individually and as a church can actually change people's lives. I know about a story of a college student. His name was Tom, and this was from years ago. Tom was a happy-go-lucky college student back in the day when, college was, I guess like it is now. When you go to class, you don't exactly wear a suit. His normal attire in college was a dirty old T-shirt, jeans, and no shoes. And he was very comfortable that way, and that's how he went to class. So when he reached a point in his college time that someone talked to him and shared faith with him, and he realized that he did trust in Christ with his life and he became a Christian, he was told that he should find a church where he should go and worship. And he realized there was a church right across the street from the college. So he made up his mind that Sunday that he would go to church and worship there. Now, this church was very traditional, very, staid, very, a lot of gray hair in that church, and doing things decently in good order. And on this particular Sunday, Tom, in his regular attire, with his wild hair and his dirty t-shirt and his jeans and no shoes in church, he walks in the back of the church. He's not been in church. He doesn't know how it works. So he comes down the aisle. The minister is in the pulpit. He's about to start his sermon. And everybody sees Tom walking down the center of the aisle. Now, what do you think those folks look like? Get a load of this guy. So he's coming down, and he's looking, Tom is, for a place to sit down, but it was full that day. The sanctuary was full of people. So he comes down, he doesn't see anywhere to sit, so he comes all the way up front of the pulpit, and he just sits on the floor. Because there's plenty of room up front on the floor. And people are aghast. What is he doing? Just then, a man from way in the back stands up. It's the deacon of the church. He's in his 80s. He's in his three-piece suit. And he slides out of his pew and he starts making his way down the aisle toward Tom. And everybody's holding their breath. Oh, boy. And all they can hear is the clicking of his cane on the floor. He's making a beeline for Tom. And the people, nobody's stopping him. Nobody's saying anything. You can't blame him for what he's about to do, because he's a man in his 80s, and, and the minister's not saying anything. He just stops speaking because he figures, let the deacon do what he has to do, and then we'll continue the service. And so the deacon gets all the way up front, and when he gets right next to Tom, he drops his cane, and he struggles to get down on the floor next to Tom. And he sits with Tom so Tom won't be alone in worship. And as some ladies in that church start to pull out their tissue and dab their eyes, the minister says, in my sermon today, you won't remember what I've said probably, but you'll never forget what you've just seen. Yes, humility, the willingness to be open, to receive, to engage, to love as Christ loved, is the answer. It's the way of Christ. It's the way he came. It's the nature of his life. And it's what he calls us to do and to be. May it be so. Oh God, forgive us if we have been proud, if we have thought of ourselves as being better than others. Remind us of the way of Christ, that we might be Christ for others. So that when people think about church and think about church people, they might say, those people have something special that I want. May your love and humility shine through us each and every day, we pray. In the name of the humble one, Jesus. Amen.